Well, Debbie and I don't go to a whole lot of movies anymore. There aren't a whole lot out there that we want to go see. We've been to see all the Star Wars movies. We've been to see all the Harry Potter movies, and we even had to continue that after our children left us. We went anyway. But back in the early 80s, there was a movie that came out, and I don't remember exactly why we chose to go see it. But it was, I think you're familiar with it, and if you have not seen it by now, spoiler alert. But anyway, it was Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it was done in the style, they say, of the old serials. I'm not old enough to remember that. Maybe some of y'all are. Where you went, and it was a continual story. But anyway, this was a very action-packed movie. And I think when I first heard about the movie, I was thinking, well, is it a movie about Noah's Ark? It was not. We went and saw the movie, and we've seen it a few times since then. And it was in the style of the old movie serials, lots of action. And the story takes place during the days of Nazi Germany. Hitler supposedly is collecting all kinds of religious objects, thinking that that will give him power. And so the Nazis are looking for the Ark of the Covenant. It has been missing now for centuries. And the story revolves around the search for the Ark. And they find it. And it's interesting to see the movie maker's view of God's power. In that one scene, while the Ark of the Covenant is stored in the warehouse, it's inside a wooden crate. And there's a Nazi insignia on the side of it. All of a sudden, that just is burned off. Apparently, God doesn't want the Nazi insignia on the side of the crate. And that great scene when they get there, the Nazis have the Ark, Indiana Jones and others, you know, they've been captured, it seems like. But anyway, you have the scene where they open up the Ark of the Covenant. They should not have done that. All of a sudden, people just disintegrate, especially if they look at it. Well, it's an interesting story, and like most things that come out of Hollywood dealing with anything having to do with the Bible, there's a whole lot more fiction than fact. Lots of unlikely things happen in the movie, but it was a great movie. However, in the Bible, we have the real Ark of the Covenant, and that's a pretty good story as well. In 1 Samuel, beginning with chapter 4, we have an interesting thing that happened to the Ark of the Covenant. Well, what was the Ark of the Covenant? I think all of you know, but just quick review. It was that chest that contained the tables of the law. It was kept in the tabernacle, and later it was kept in the temple. God directed Moses to make an ark of acacia wood. He gave the precise dimensions for it. It was to be overlaid with pure gold within and without. It had a crown of gold about it. There were rings of gold at the corner, and through those rings, staves or rods that were also covered with gold would be put through so they could carry the ark from place to place. On it was a mercy seat of gold with 2 winged cherubim. And these were winged creatures with both animal and human features. And they were placed on the top of the ark. It was there that God promised to meet and talk with Moses. The Ark of the Covenant was very important to Israel. It was a symbol of God's presence with them. It went before Israel as they journeyed from place to place. When they crossed the Jordan to go into the land of Canaan, the priests carried the ark in front, and as they stepped into the waters parted, and the Israelites were able to cross the Jordan River on dry land. It played a role in the capture of Jericho. They marched around the walls of the city. The Ark of the Covenant was involved in that. And there was power connected with the Ark of the Covenant. It was to be treated in a certain way. At a later time, during the reign of David, as the ark was being transported, it started to tip. A man named Uzzah reached out to steady it. When he touched the ark, he was struck dead immediately. That may be a future sermon a few months down the way. After the destruction of the first temple, the fate of the Ark of the Covenant is unknown. I assure you, it was not found during World War II. Some synagogues, at least, I'm not sure about in the first century, but in more recent times, have a Ark of the Covenant depicted upon a wall that faces Jerusalem. Of course, the Ark of the Covenant is long gone. And of course, the law of Moses is no longer in effect. We are now in the new, under the new covenant of Jesus Christ. On one occasion, as I said, starting here in 1 Samuel 4, the Ark of the Covenant was stolen from Israel. And I want us to look at that account this evening. And we begin in chapter 4. We see that the Ark of the Covenant was misused. Things were not going well in Israel. The Philistines had control of the land. The book of Judges mentions a 40-year rule that the Philistines had over Israel. At this time, the religious leaders were not what they ought to be. In fact, they were evil. Eli, the priest, had not been so bad, but he was getting very old. His sons, however, Hophni and Phinehas, were worthless men, chapter 2, verse 12. They despised the offering of the Lord. They did not observe the Mosaic law regarding offerings. They also had immoral relations with women who served in the tent of meeting. Now, Eli spoke to his sons about their conduct. They just paid no attention to him. A bright spot did develop in Israel's history at this time. Hannah prayed for a son. She promised to give him to God, and she did so. She received the birth of a son. She brought him to Eli to serve the Lord. As we saw last Sunday evening, God spoke to Samuel. It was such an unusual thing at the time that at first they didn't know what was going on. But they finally realized what was happening. And in that first conversation that God has with Samuel, he tells Samuel what is going to happen to Eli and to his sons. Basically that the priesthood is not going to continue in Eli's family. Eli says, now I want you to tell me what God told you, and Samuel does. Well, Samuel grew up, and he was recognized as a prophet. Chapter 3, verse 20. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. God speaks to Samuel, and Samuel gives instructions to Israel. Israel met the Philistines in battle. That's at the first of chapter 4. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. We sometimes sing a hymn that mentions our Ebenezer. What is an Ebenezer? Here I raise my Ebenezer. Well, it's a stone of help. And this is a term that is, it was a place here in the Old Testament. The name may have been given later, or it may have even been a different location. But at any rate, they go into battle on this occasion, and Israel is defeated. About 4,000 men are killed. And, you know, God has been with Israel in numerous battles. They've been victorious. And so the elders of Israel asked, well, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Why did God let us lose? We're his people. And they decide they're going to go into battle again, but this time they're going to take some action to assure victory. They take the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh. And they say, verse 3, this will deliver us from the power of our enemies. The Ark is brought out. Hophni and Phinehas accompany it. The Israelites are excited about the appearance of the Ark. They shouted. It was probably the first time that the Ark had been brought into the camp since the settling of Canaan. You know, usually you didn't see the Ark of the Covenant. It was there in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies. The Philistines heard the shout of Israel. They became afraid at the thought of Israel's gods. That's the way they refer to God in the plural. And it's interesting in verse 8, the Philistines remembered the plagues that God had brought on Egypt some years before. This was not isolated news. They worshiped their gods, but they also recognized that Israel had a god or gods, they viewed it in the plural. But they knew that this God had dealt harshly with Egypt, with Pharaoh of Egypt. Well, they have another battle. They've got the Ark of the Covenant there with them. They're thinking this is going to ensure them a victory. It does not. Israel is defeated again, and 30,000 of their soldiers are killed. We need to notice something as we think about what Israel did here. Where did God tell Israel to take the ark into battle? He did not on this occasion. They didn't ask God for help. They didn't ask God for guidance. And God was not happy with Israel. They were not living in a way that was pleasing to him overall. They were worshiping other gods. He lets Israel be defeated. And they don't seem to grasp, well, why should God let us be defeated? They don't think of the right answer. They may have a right question, but they have the wrong answer. What they should have realized is that God was displeased with them. After all, there were Hophni and Phinehas, their leaders, who were evil men. Instead of looking to God for instruction, the Israelites make a decision on their own, and they make one. They assume that if the ark of God is taken into battle, they will win. They're viewing it as a good luck charm. Now, the ark had been used to demonstrate God's power in the past. It was the place where God's presence dwelt. But God did not tell them to take the ark into battle on this occasion. That was their own idea. Basically, they had a bit of an external religion. They did not check their relationship with God. They sought help from a religious object. We see similar things even today. Some people get all involved in the externals of religion. It can be a cross they wear around the neck. It can be a painting in the house. Sometimes even the actual Bible is kind of made an object. People don't read the message, they don't follow the message, but they think if they have the Bible in their possession, that it is a blessing to them. There are people who come up with all kinds of ideas that are not according to God's will. That does not work. Well, we have this battle. Israel loses again. And what happens sometimes when you lose a battle? In this particular case, the Ark of the Covenant is taken hostage. The Philistines have the opportunity to take the Ark of the Covenant with them. And they think that's a pretty good idea on the front end. This is important to Israel. We've now got it. Losing 30,000 men is bad, but they've also lost the Ark of God. We read that a messenger runs from the battle to bring the bad news. He's dressed in the clothes of deepest mourning. Eli is out sitting by the road. Chapter 4, verse 13 says, his heart was trembling for the ark of God. Maybe Eli realized it should not have been taken into battle. When the news of the loss and of the capture of the ark comes to the community, the city cried out at the tragic news. And Eli says, what does all this commotion mean? Now, Eli is 98 years old at this point. He could no longer see. He probably had cataracts. At any rate, he couldn't see. The message was delivered to him, chapter 4, verse 17. Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. We lost the battle. That's bad news. Your two sons were killed. That's even worse news. The ark of God has been captured. And when the messenger mentioned that the ark of God had been captured, that is when Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. And when he fell off, his neck was broken and he died. Eli got the message. We also have a little detail here that Phinehas, his wife, heard the news. She was pregnant. She found out that her husband had died, that Eli had just now died, her father-in-law. And so she goes into labor. She dies in the process of childbirth. The women that are with her try to reassure her. She does have time to give a name to the son that is born. And she names him Ichabod. And the name Ichabod means no glory. Well, certainly the glory has departed from Israel. The Ark of the Covenant is no longer with them. These deaths have occurred. Verse 22. She said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the Ark of God has been captured. Israel's wrong action resulted in defeat and the capture of the Ark of the Covenant. The earthly throne of God's glory had been taken from them. This sign of the covenant of grace was gone. Still today, people decide to do things their own way, to ignore what God says. And the consequences are not good. Sometimes people are just overwhelmed. I did exactly what I wanted. I did not do what God wanted me to do, but I'm having these bad consequences. Why is that? And some people don't ever seem to get the message of what they did wrong. Well, their story continues, chapter 5. We see the Ark of the Covenant unwanted. The Philistines had taken quite a prize, the Ark of the God of Israel. And so they bring the Ark of the Covenant to their capital city, Ashdod. They've got this great prize there among them. They knew that the Ark was important to Israel. It was a great prize for them to have in their possession. It's somewhat like, from time to time, maybe a jet plane or some other great military instrument will come into the hands of the opposing side. These are multi-million-dollar sophisticated weapons of war. And when the enemy gets a chance to look them over, they can see, okay, here's how this works. And here's how we can deal with this. Well, the Philistines have a great prize. What do they do with the Ark of the Covenant? Well, they put it in the house of Dagon, their god. They're basically offering the Ark of the Covenant. They're offering Israel's God to their god, Dagon. After all, they view that Dagon has given them victory over Israel. The image of Dagon was part man, part fish. The upper part was a bearded man with hands. The bottom half looked like a fish. The Philistines connected Dagon with their agriculture, basically a fertility god. Samson, on one occasion, had destroyed a temple of Dagon as his last act before he himself died in that event. But now the Ark of God is here. It's set next to Dagon in his temple. Early the next morning, Dagon had fallen face down in front of the Ark. A worship position. The Philistines probably thought, well, it's just an accident, you know. Just something happened and Dagon fell over. Isn't it nice that you have a God who falls over? That doesn't give me a lot of confidence. But anyway, they set him back up. The next morning, Dagon has fallen down before the Ark again. And this time, his hands and his head and his hands are cut off. Chapter 5, verse 4. God gives a clear sign of his power. And we have the note here that the hands fell on the threshold. It said, from that day on, the priest and others didn't step on that spot that Dagon had touched. They weren't going to defile it. This is not the only way that God makes his displeasure known to the Philistines. Chapter 5, verse 6, his hand was heavy on Ashdod. They are afflicted. Lots of people or afflicted. And the translation can vary, but it was tumors or boils. The King James says emerods. Some have interpreted it to be hemorrhoids. Whatever it was a painful affliction. It possibly was the bubonic plague, because we see that rats or mice play a role in this apparently. As we remember, the bubonic plague was rats giving the disease to, rats carried the fleas bit people, and they got the bubonic plague. Anyway, Ashdod is afflicted. They say, we want the ark out of here. So it's moved, brought over to Gath. They were struck with tumors, chapter 5, verse 8. They say, we want it out of here. They move it over to Ekron. And there several men died. The punishment seems to become more severe the longer God is ignored. The ark was like a hot potato. Nobody wanted it. God was not willing to sit next to Dagon. He alone is God. He demonstrated his power against this false god. And you know, it's interesting that in some ways the Philistines were more observant of the power of God than the Israelites had been themselves. We must remember that God will be our only God. We cannot worship God and some other God as well. Well, next we see in chapter 6 that the Ark of the Covenant is returned to Israel. The Ark had been in the Philistines' country some 7 months. The people didn't want it. It was nothing but a problem. So the question is, what shall we do with the Ark of the Lord? What do you do with a stolen Ark? How do you get rid of this Ark so you can stop the plagues? Well, the priests tell the people to send the Ark back with the guilt offering. Don't send it back with no gift or nothing with it. If they are healed, when they send the Ark back, they will know that it was God's hand inflicting them. The priests weren't yet ready to give the true God the credit for what had been happening, or the blame. And so there's the guilt offering. What is it? What's the offering? It's golden tumors and golden mice. It was a heathen custom to make a representation of the diseased member of the body part healed. You make a representation of the danger that you'd pass through. In recent years in India, a person was cured of a disease, or a person who was cured of a disease would take a present of gold, silver, or copper made in the shape of the diseased or injured member. I'm glad we don't do that over here. There were the mice, are mentioned here. God had possibly caused a plague of mice in the land, or the mice might have had a role in the spreading of the disease. But the offerings are sent to appease God's wrath. The priests say, put the Ark of the Covenant on a new cart and hook up to the Ark to pull it 2 unused cows. They've never pulled a cart before. This is a sign of honor. But they do have a test. They use cows rather than male oxen. They locked up the calves. These cows had just given birth to calves. They locked up the calves. The priest said, now if the oxen go a certain route, we will know that Israel's God is responsible. The most likely scenario will be for cows who have just given birth to want to go to the calves. But instead they go straight back to Israel, to Beth Shemesh. And the people there are glad to see the Ark of God. They offer sacrifices. The Philistines return back home. But you know, the Israelites do not act properly. Some of them are struck dead. But the Ark of the Covenant is taken to the house of Abinadab. Eliezer is consecrated and given the job of caring for the Ark of the Covenant. It remains with him for about 20 years, according to chapter 7. Samuel then calls for the repentance of the people. He says, repent with all your heart. Remove the gods from among you. Israel was still worshiping false gods. Samuel says, serve God alone. He gathered the people at Mizpah. They fasted. They confessed their sins. And it came time for another battle against the Philistines. Might have even been the same place as 20 years earlier. This time Israel urged Samson to appeal to God for help. He did so, and the Philistines were defeated. You know, the Philistines realized their mistake in having the ark of God among them, and they made corrections. And Israel itself later returned to God and looked to him for help. It's very important that we don't make false assumptions when it comes to God. Well, I think the story of the stolen ark is interesting, and not only that, it teaches good lessons. We must not make false assumptions in our relationship with God. We must do things God's way. It's very important that we seek to obey God. God doesn't accept just any service. And yes, we want God to be with us, and God will be with us. But let us not make false assumptions about who God is with, who He's blessing. Sometimes a particular nation will say, well, God is on our side. Sometimes the nation is not on God's side. We must take care that we don't put our faith in an external, not a building, not a cross, not anything else. And we need to remember that God is powerful. He can punish greatly those who disobey, but He gives great blessings to those who serve Him. Well, in the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, Hitler was looking for power by collecting a religious object. He looked in the wrong place. He should have looked in God's Word. He should have obeyed it. History would have been far different if Hitler had looked in the right place, don't you think? In fact, the history of the world would have been so much different if those who ruled really sought to follow God, if the people sought to follow God. But we ask, what is our relationship with God? We must not make false assumptions in our relationship with God. When we go to His Word and we seek to do His will, that is important.